is life with all of life's contradictions, difficulties, and unknowns, and absurdities, and impossibilities. That faith has to be able to make a space for those things. We learned about Rabbi Nachman's concept of the Chalal HaPanui, the void that is necessary for creation to come into being, but a void that is in some sense also empty of God, and how what emerges from the void are those questions without answers. And for Rabbi Nachman and for Rav Shagar, the questions without answers, theological questions without answers, much of which has to do with theological questions of why is there so much horror and suffering in this world. The religious stories that we tell have to be able to make a space for those questions because they're real and they don't have answers. And therefore, the religious stories we tell can't be stories that attempt to offer answers to those questions. And of course, if there are questions, those questions can help cause us to doubt. But as we saw last time with Rav Shagar, doubts are the sign that our faith is real. Because if you don't have doubts, it means that your faith is not disprovable, right? In a certain sense, your faith has no stakes if it cannot be disproven, right? If anything you encounter, you're just like, I have faith. I know exactly what's going on here. For Rav Shagar, that's not maybe even really faith at all. It's something profoundly disconnected from it because it's disconnected from the world. And he even uses the term of it being idolatrous, and that it actually requires a certain amount of uncertainty or a recognition of unknowability to be able to encounter something real, right? If you I'll use a simple example here, right? If you think you know everything about a person, then every encounter you have with that person is through that lens, through those lens of ideas or however we want to look at it. But in truth, if you think you know everything about a person, then you really can't encounter them at all because what you constantly encounter is exactly what you think to find. And again, for faith to be real, it has to make space for the possibility of finding out what you don't know, because that's what it always means to be in a relationship, whether it is with God or with human beings. And that takes us to today's shiur, which is about we'll call covenantal faith. In this sense, we're going to try to move towards a more proactive understanding of how Rav Shagar conceives of faith, knowing that it's, again, something that's so difficult, particularly in the modern world where there are no proofs for God or even proofs for the Torah being from Sinai, so to speak. And the idea that we're going to use to explore all this is this idea of brit, this idea of covenant, which is an absolutely central concept for Rav Shagar, very, very important for him. It may be the word that repeats most in all of his writings. And as we know, it is a concept, covenant, that is absolutely central to Judaism. We just read it last week, right? When the Jews are at Har Sinai, they make a brit with God. And it is that brit that comes to define everything about what it means to be a Jew. So we're going to have to unpack what brit, what covenant is all about, but it is central to understanding anything about what it means to be a Jew, and therefore it becomes essential for us to think about what it means to have faith and relate to anything of substance. Now, to sort of dig in a little bit deeper on the idea of covenant, it's an idea that we throw around as Jews a lot of the time. We'll talk about covenant, we'll talk about brit, but I would argue that we don't really understand what it is, because a covenant is not something that we typically encounter in our day-to-day lives. Right? If you go around, asking people who are, let's say, secular, like, when was the last time they made a covenant, or are they part of any covenants? Right? They're probably not going to really know what you're talking about, because it's not a concept that we typically encounter outside of religious thinking, for better or for worse. So we have to understand, what exactly is a covenant? Why is it so central? Why is it that when God and the Jewish people had that profound moment in last week's parsha at Har Sinai, that the result of that was covenant? Now, what we have to understand is that when the idea of covenant is explored, and this is true both in terms of biblical history in the context of the ancient Near East, right? The ways in which covenant is often explained sounds usually closest to our modern notions of contract, right? If you're familiar with the idea, I mean, again, I don't know if there's any lawyers listening, right? There usually is if you're teaching a bunch of Jews. But a contract is something we understand, right? A contract is when two sides enter into an agreement freely, in which the contract defines what the responsibilities are for each side to the other, and what the consequences are if each side does not live up to their responsibilities, right? That is the nature of a contract. right? I rent an apartment here in Yerushalayim, right? I have a contract with the landlord. It's very, very clear, right? It defines our relationship to each other. She is the landlord, I am the renter, right? I pay her a certain amount a month. That gives us legal access to this apartment, right? She has certain responsibilities when it comes to maintaining the apartment and fixing things if they're broken. We both entered into the agreement freely. Nobody forced me to sign it. Nobody forced her to rent it to us. And if either of us violate the terms of that contract, we essentially go our separate ways. So contract's an idea we certainly understand. Like I said, covenant is often understood in those terms. Again, if you think about it, at Har Sinai, the way that we think of the Torah at Har Sinai as contractual is the sense in which, right, God and the Jewish people entered into a mutual agreement with each other, right? God said, you do this. God said, if you do this, I will do this. And we said, Naaseh v'nishma, like we entered into it, right? We laid out the guidelines were laid out, right? We entered into it, we agreed upon it, right? And that defined the relationship that God and the Jewish people were going to have with each other. Now, again, you can look at it that way as contracts, but as we also know, the Torah is not really a contract. And if we have to point to what the fundamental difference between contract and covenant is, I would say there are two features that really define covenant as being separate from contract. Number one is the idea that covenants, particularly in the Torah, are often founded in some way on love, right? Love is at the heart of Brit, meaning a Brit is what you make when there is love, right? Love is what creates the possibility of Brit. I'm not saying that applies in every single example, but certainly in some of the very notable examples, that is absolutely the case. Probably the most prominent example in Tanakh, actually, of this being true, is with David and Yehonatan. When David vanquishes Goliath, right? He presents himself to Shaul and Yehonatan. King Shaul, Yehonatan's the son, the prince, the man who will be the next king. It says in Sefer Shmuel that Yehonatan falls in love with David in that moment, and as a result, Yehonatan makes a brit with David. He actually literally takes like the clothes off his back, like his belt, and he gives it to David to enter into a brit. That's the classic example where it's very, very explicit that we go from love to brit. Of course, we know in Jewish thought, already in the Nevi'im, right, the relationship between God and the Jewish people is framed as a marital one, right? And as we know, this is probably the most significant metaphor of brit in Jewish thought in the Tanakh and beyond is the idea of marriage, right? The God and the Jewish people entered into a marriage with each other at Har Sinai, right? The Luchot, the Ten Commandments, are either understood as the Ketubah or understood as the Tabat, the ring that is of Kedushin, right? But what the Jewish people and God entered into was a marriage, a brit in that sense. So the first thing that makes a covenant different is that it is founded in love. And then the second thing that makes a covenant different from a contract, and I'll just point out again, contracts are not about love, right? Contracts are about, what am I going to get out of this? It is very much quid pro quo. I get into it because I'm going to get something out of it. There's whole very specific conditions. So those conditions aren't met, I'm out of there, right? That is the way a contract works. Contract is always based almost exclusively on self-interest. What again defines a covenant as being different is not just that it is in some way founded in love, but that it is inextricable, right? What really makes a covenant unique is the way it binds the two parties together in a sense that they cannot easily extricate themselves from the relationship, right? That is what a covenant is really very powerful. We'll see this in just a moment, is the way it binds the two parties together. Contracts can be broken. One of the sides can leave the contract, but covenants, it's not that simple, right? When you make a covenant, I don't want to say it's absolutely permanent. We know obviously a Jewish marriage is not absolutely permanent, and we think about that as a covenant. But when it comes, at least with the breed of between God and the Jewish people, there is something inextricable about it, such that the Jews nor God can escape what they signed up for. And if you know anything about love, right, you also know that when you love somebody, there's something about it that makes it really very difficult for you to separate from them. That makes it really very difficult to stop loving them. Right? When you fall in love with someone, there's a sense in which they pitch up a tent inside of you, right? They sort of start like You can't escape them. They're in you, and if the love is mutual, you're in them. And that makes it profound, but it also makes it really, really, really challenging. So again, that's just sort of the theoretical background here, but you'll see how that notion of covenants, of love, of being inextricably bound to the other, becomes essential for how Rav Shagar thinks about it and all the implications that'll emerge from it. And again, it's a radical idea, but it's something Rav Shagar emphasizes a lot. We think in terms of contract today as modern people. We think about our relationship with God in terms of contract, right? And this has been said by Jewish thinkers in the 20th century, right? God broke the contract with the Holocaust. And when God broke the contract, like, you get to do what any contract gets broken. You get to leave it, or you get to say, I'm no longer bound by the terms of the contract, right? That is the way we think, right? We don't get to be coerced into obligations and responsibilities that are not, that we didn't sign up for, that are unfair in some way. We don't think in terms of covenant. We think in terms of contract. But Jewish life is founded on covenant. The way we are bound to people, bound to God, Torah, and the Jewish people, whether we like it or not, and the way in which that connection that we have to them, right, exceeds our ability to really, really understand it. So let's dive into Rav Shagar here. This is actually from one of Rav Shagar's earlier essays on the Parsha, from his time at Yeshivat HaKotzel when he was the Rosh Yeshiva there. And he, again, already early in his life, is identifying the centrality of Brit. And he's noticing it is on Parshat Nitzavim, right? Moshe affirms the Brit once again between God and the Jewish people at the end of the Torah. And what Rav Shagar does here is he cites a very interesting text from the first Rebbe of Lubavitch, in which Rav Shagar is trying to define what a Brit is all about. Because again, if you read the Torah, you got to know what a Brit is about. Because again, it comes up over and over and over again as this defining frame for the Jewish people's relationship to God. So here's what he says, citing here from the first Rebbe of Lubavitch, the Alter Rebbe, who says as follows in Likutei Torah. He says, two who were our beloved to each other make a brit between them, so their love will not come to an end. For if that which the love was dependent on would be forever, there would be no need to make a brit between them. Rather, it is because they fear that maybe that which is the cause of their love will end, and so too will their love. Through making a brit, their love will be eternal and never falter, and no internal or external obstacle will separate them. So the Alter Rebbe here makes a sort of a counterintuitive point, in that if you want love to last, he's saying, you got to make a brit. Right? If you want your love to be something permanent, something eternal, you have to make a brit. Now, the reason this is counterintuitive is that normally we think it's the other way around. Normally we think, I can only enter into a brit if I know my love is going to last forever, right? This is a theme that occurs in romantic comedies, right? That the two people fall for each other, but one keeps having cold feet about really making it an enduring relationship because they're not really sure if like their love, their feelings are going to last. And that's the way we think, right? Like if you're not 100% sure that your love is going to really endure, then you really can't commit to this relationship, right? Rav Shagar is saying you never really know whether love is going to endure until you make a brit, right? There's something about love that is sort of either transient or sort of stands outside of time, right? Love happens to you and you feel it intensely, but to make it last, that requires something else, right? There's a difference between love and marriage, right? Love is the way, again, you fall in love, you feel bound to the other, you feel like your whole world is suddenly turned upside down, but only marriage turns that love into making it something real and something enduring. And that is what the Alter Rebbe is getting at here, right? Because the challenge with love, he's noting this, and he's implicitly referring back to a mission in Pirkei Avot, is that love, to a certain extent, is always conditional. We fall in love with people because we think they're the most amazing people in the world, right? We fall in love with somebody and we can count the many ways in which, we think they are amazing and why we love them. But if that's true, if we fall in love with someone because we've got a list of 10 things about what makes them so amazing, we run the risk that when those 10 things are no longer there, like perhaps our love will not be there either. And what's unique about love and covenant is that there's something about covenant that is unconditional, right? There's something about covenant that reflects a notion that you are bound to the other forever, like that you can't really escape that. And that's obviously very scary, but it's what makes love so incredibly powerful, right? That love is this force that can bind us to others forever, right? There's nothing else that can do that, right? Two people who have nothing in common, come from totally different worlds, can somehow experience something we call love that forever binds them together in ways closer than anything else that human beings can imagine. Right? There's something very profound about the way that love works in that fashion. And again, it requires a breed to make it real, to make it enduring. And we know this, like we all know people who have this like incredible like love moment, love relationship, and it kind of like is intense for a short period of time, and then like doesn't really go anywhere. And sometimes people like that. They like the romanticism of that moment when they felt that intense love. But the Jewish approach is always going to say that, like, if there's not an attempt to make that love real, and that's what marriage is, to make it enduring, right, then you are missing something absolutely, fundamental to what love is about. So that's the Alter Rebbe's first point. The second point he says that when you make a brit, right, you make between themselves such a strong and mighty connection, they become inextricably connected in their love by a wondrous connection that transcends reason and logic. For even though reason and logic may dictate that their love should end or even turn into hatred, even so, because of the brit they have made, their love must exist forever. Right? And what he's saying here is that, as I was saying this before, that love binds us to the other in a way that is unconditional, such that even if the person changes, right, even if we can say to ourselves, okay, we've reached a point in our relationship where this doesn't make any sense, like I don't know like why I'm still with you, that love and covenant make it such that we can't leave, that we still feel bound to them, even when we don't have necessarily good reasons to still feel bound to them. And again, this is completely countercultural to the way we think about marriage today, right? The way marriage works is that when you stop getting out of it what you want and what you expect, right, you leave, right? And to a certain extent, there's good reason for that, right? If you stay in a relationship where you're not getting what you want and what you need, we call that abuse, right? So this very notion that you can be unconditionally bound to another person is not so easy for us, right? It has elements of what we might call slavery, right? Like slavery is what it means to be unconditionally bound to another, to not have control over your own destiny. It's somehow they have to some level of control with you. But what covenant is trying to do is navigate a path on the one side of contract, which you freely enter and leave at any time. There's nothing really, truly enduring about it. It's about your own self-interest. It's about you. It's not about the other. That's one extreme. The other extreme is slavery, right? And that's the experience of being so completely bound to the other that you have no freedom, no autonomy, no agency. You must just submit to them, right? Covenant is about something in between, where there's a space for both sides to actually encounter each other, right? Contract's only about yourself, and slavery is just about the other. Covenant is about trying to bring the two sides together into a relationship. But again, what makes covenant challenging is the way that we feel bound to the other in ways that we can't escape. And again, I'll use the example I was saying before about love, right? You probably have had people in your life who you loved, and for some reason that relationship ended, but you still feel bound to them in ways that you can't like. Meaning, this is, again, a theme in romance novels and movies. You fall in love with somebody, you don't want to love them. It's not good for you, right? It presents all sorts of problems for one reason or another, but you can't stop loving them, right? You can't tell yourself, okay, I'm going to stop loving you. I don't want to love you, even if I think I have good reason to. There's something about love that always exceeds us in that way. And that's what makes it so powerful. To feel bound to the other, even when we don't have reason, or even when they've done things wrong that are so difficult and so hard. So again, the Alter Rebbe says, why is this the case? Because they have come together in brit and connection. It is as if they have become one flesh. And just as one is not able to stop loving themselves, so too they cannot stop loving their beloved. And this is the critical point. I keep saying that we feel bound to the other. And what that really means is that we don't know. We can't so easily tell when we love someone and we are bound to them in covenant, where we end and where they begin, right? There's a sense in which, not necessarily the two become one, that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, but the way in which the two become bound to each other, that we, like, again, I'll use my own example. Like, there's parts of me in which I'm not almost totally sure where I end and my wife begins. Like, my wife's voice is in my head, whether I like it or not. That's what it means to love somebody and to be bound to them. And that's what it means to be in covenant. And again, if we want to extrapolate the example here more fully, right, the kind of covenant in Judaism is always there's three directions to it, or maybe really two, right? There's us and God and us and our fellow Jews, right? The covenant always has those elements to it. And what mediates, at least between us and God, and we'll see this, is the Torah. Torah is the way we engage with God, the way we engage with dialogue with God. And obviously the mitzvot in Jewish life are how we engage with the Jewish people. So we talk about being in a covenant with God, Torah, and the Jewish people. It means we feel bound to those things in ways that we can't necessarily escape, don't fully understand, but recognize that, like I said, the line between we end and where God, Torah, and the Jewish people begin isn't always so clear to us as Jews. That's what makes those relationships incredibly powerful. It also is what makes them really, really hard, as we know from our own family experiences. But again, we don't know. They are like my left arm, right? Like, they are a part of me in some way, even though they're also not me entirely. Like, I never fully know my wife. I can't speak for her, but at the same time, I do hear her voice in my head, and I do feel bound to her. And that's what a covenant does. It ties us to the other. And in this case, as I'm saying, God, Torah, and the Jewish people. The last thing the Alter Rebbe says here, he says, therefore, the Torah uses the language of cutting a brit, koreit brit. That's the language in the Torah. And what the Alter Rebbe points here to is the brit ben habitzarim. It's one of the brits that God makes with Abraham. And the way that brit works is that Abraham has to cut a bunch of animals in half. And basically, he creates a little pathway between these animals that are, these carcasses, these half carcasses that are lining the way. And as it says here, he cut the calf, cuts it in half, and he passed between the parts. Avraham and basically God are passing between these parts as a way of saying, the Alter Rebbe says, it was as if to say that the two of them have passed through one body to become a unity. That it's the two passing through the animals cut in half that is a way of symbolizing how God and Abraham become bound together. And of course, ultimately, as we as Jews become bound to each other, and to God and to the Torah. So that's what it means to be in covenant. It's not an easy thing, just as anybody who's married knows. It's not an easy thing to be bound to another in that fashion. So then the question becomes, what does this have to do with faith? And we're going to develop this. But the first thing we have to understand is when we're thinking within a covenantal model, is that faith is always going to be understood in terms of loyalty to the covenant. And that's a very broad idea. But what it means is that when I feel bound to the other, I feel on some level responsible to the other, and I remain loyal to the other and those responsibilities. That doesn't always mean that I'm going to do whatever the other wants. It doesn't always mean that I even know exactly what the other wants. But it means that I feel bound, and on some level, I try to remain loyal to that, right? Again, like a marriage, right? You remain loyal to your spouse, even when you're not together, even when things are difficult, even when you don't know, where you're going, right? Like that there's a sense of loyalty. That is the term that we use to think about how we are bound to them, and we want to remain bound to them in some way. And that's what Rav Shagar says here. He says, can we build our lives with a covenant, with loyalty to distinct and basic principles, which allow passionate devotion? Meaning to be a Jew that takes covenant seriously, shomer habrit, which is both a rabbinic and a mystical idea. It means being loyal to the things that we feel bound to, the things that we feel bound to that give a sense of structure and meaning and purpose in our lives. He says, do we have a clear center for our lives, which gives them their depth, right? To be in a covenant, and Rav Shagar is pointing to this, right? It gives a profound structure to your life and a meaning to your life, right? It now gives a shape to it. When my marriage with my wife, defines my existence in some very, very profound ways and gives it a shape and a form and a context that I can't, escape. And to be loyal to that covenant is to be loyal to that structure and foundation that now shapes my life. He says, Jews who live in a covenant live in loyalty and connection, right? Because that's what a brit is. You're bound to something now, something that is fundamental to who you are in the world. He says this is reflected in his loyalty in the family sphere to his wife and children, metaphorically. It is not a matter subject to judgment or death. That's the thing about covenants. You can't really question it in a sense because it's beyond your reason to be able to explain it, right? I don't know if Rav Shagar says it here, but if I come up with a list of all the reasons why I love my wife, that list is never going to, if I give somebody else to read it, And even if it's 100% true, it's not like that list is going to be able to convince other people to fall in love with my wife, right? We don't fall in love with people and feel bound to them because we have a list of clear explanations of who they are and what we're getting out of it, right? Our love for others always exceeds our ability to rationally or discursively define it and understand it and explain it, right? It exceeds our ability to do that. That's why that list can never fully capture the force of the love that I feel for my wife. So when Rav Shagar says here, it's not a matter subject to judgment or doubt, he's not saying that it's like, you just have to accept it. But what he's saying is when you feel bound to another, you can try to explain it as best as you can, but all the words in the dictionary are never going to be enough to fully get at what's going on here. Right? And you just know that, like you're bound. That's what it means. I mean, I'll use another example that Rav Shagar doesn't, but it's worth kind of thinking about the way that covenant, carries us. We feel bound to the other even when it seems impossible, right? So there's a verse in Shir HaShirim, Aza kemavet ahava, that love is as strong as death, right? It's not necessarily stronger than death, but it's as strong as death. And part of the way we can think about that idea is the way in which our love continues for those that we love even after they die, right? Even after the people we love are no longer here in this world, somehow we still love them. The love continues in ways that are very palpable for us, in ways that are often very painful for us. If we didn't love our loved ones after they die, we wouldn't be grieving and feel so much pain when they die, right? The fact that the pain for our loved ones can continue years, if not decades after they die, shows the way in which love and covenant binds us to others in ways that, again, are not fully explainable, right? Why is it that I should cry about my grandfather who died 18 years ago, right? Like, why today should that still move me to be able to cry for his loss? It just doesn't make sense unless you realize that love binds us to people in ways that never is going to fully make sense. It is not subject to judgment and doubt, as Rav Shagar said. He said, this is a starting point for his life, which establishes dedication and commitments following right? That's what it does. When you're bound to another, suddenly you're committed to them. Again, there's structures, there's responsibilities. It's not always laid out clearly, but you know that you feel called to the other by the other, and you can't escape that. He says, following the covenants, his life is lived out of a constant search for meaning, out of an understanding of what is the thing into which and for which I get up in the morning, right? Once you're in a covenant, like you now have this thing, right? I mean, I keep picking on my wife here. I wake up in the morning, I see my wife, right? She's laying there in the bed right next to me, right? Like that is the reality of being in covenant. You have something, somebody, some other that is like fully in your world and defining your world, right? Like going to sleep is a very intimate thing, right? It's something you do like by yourself. But suddenly there's another person there. And then that becomes, again, a good metaphor for describing what it means to be in covenant. Even in your most intimate, private moments, there's somebody else there. And they are, providing, again, a shape and a form and a meaning to your existence. He says here, the thing, like I said, that for which I get up in the morning, the thing that motivates me to act during my day and when I lie down to sleep. That's what covenant pushes us towards. And to have faith means to be able to be loyal to the covenant. I'll use a metaphor that Franz Rosenzweig uses, and Rav Shagar cites Franz Rosenzweig, consistently. So it's he doesn't use it, but I think it very much fits here. And to be in a covenant means to be able to hear and feel the call of the other, even if they're not physically calling to us. We hear them calling to us. We feel being pulled towards them, being bound towards them. And to be in a covenant, to be loyal to a covenant, says I still hear that call. Right? I still hear my wife's call when I'm thousands of miles away. Right? I still hear my grandfather's calling. He hasn't been alive for 18 years. Right? My oldest son is named after him. Right? I still feel that call. Right? And again, for the Jewish people, after the Churban, after the destruction of the temples, after exile, after the Holocaust, right? To have faith through any of those impossible situations means on some level that we can still hear God's call. That we can hear God's call. When we hear God's call, we do what everybody does when we hear our name being called. We just like turn around, right? We feel ourselves being pulled, because that's what it means to be in covenant. To feel that there's this thing out there that is you are bound to, that helps shape your world, and that calls to you. And when it calls to you, you cannot help but turn and want to respond to it. So the question, of course, becomes, again, I'm trying to lay out here sort of the theoretical, metaphorical way of understanding covenants. Like, what does this mean practically? right? God's not speaking to us. We're not prophets. God's not speaking to us in the kind of way that I have a relationship with my wife, right? So then what does this even mean, especially in modernity after the Holocaust, after, again, what does it mean to be loyal to a covenant, to hear, God's call? So I think this is where Shagar is very, very thoughtful. And to a certain extent, he's going to offer an approach here that's a little bit more intellectual, but it's one that deeply speaks to me because I think it just gets at something very truthful, which is the way that a Jew experiences the covenant with God, the way that a Jew can continue to hear God call to them, even today, even right now, is through the Torah, right? The Torah is the framework that enables the Brit to continue, right? It's the way in which God keeps calling to us and the way we keep responding to God, right? Rav Shagar doesn't say this, but I think to be a Jew in the modern world, it can be difficult, sometimes almost impossible, to look at history or look at our experience of the world and say, that's where I'm going to find God's call. There's many reasons why that feels impossible, or a rational scientific understanding of the world and how it functions, right? The horrors that we experience, right? The earthquake in Turkey, 30,000 plus people killed. And we have rabbis here claiming that's God's, punishment on the Turks who were evil to Israel, right? It's hard to see God in the world. And the people who do, I think we're deeply skeptical of. But where we do find ourselves still bound to God and dialogue with God is through the Torah. And that is very important for Rav Shagar. If you want to be part of the Brit with God, the Jewish Brit, like the only way to do that, it's inescapable, I think, especially for the modern Jew, is you have to have a relationship to Torah. You have to have a deep, abiding relationship to Torah. So Rav Shagar emphasizes this in many places. We'll look briefly here at a selection from B'Torah Yehageh. It's Rav Shagar's book on Torah study and different ways of Gemara study and how it should be thought about. Very important book. And he emphasizes in this book of the Torah as Brit and trying to think about what does it mean to learn Torah in a way that is covenantal. And what he opens by noticing, he says, God only made a Brit with Israel over those matters that were oral, i.e. the oral Torah, meaning that this is a line from Chazal. Chazal, the rabbis emphasize that the Brit between God and the Jewish people is not the written Torah, but the oral Torah, which is a very interesting point. Right, we have to understand, like, why is it the oral Torah? Like, if anything, it's the written Torah. That's what God gave to the Jewish people at Sinai. That's the covenantal moment. Why could it be with the oral Torah? That doesn't make sense. So part of the idea behind this, and this is just important to know historically, is that the Jews are the only one who received the written Torah. What do I mean by this? Well, we were the only ones who received the written Torah at Mount Sinai, but since then, there are other peoples, other religions that see themselves also as the inheritor of the written Torah. Right, primarily the Christians, right, what they call the Old Testament. And for Chazal, there was an awareness that both Christians and Jews claimed the Torah was theirs, the written Torah was theirs. So if so, and the Midrash in other places says this, right, how is God going to discern who his true people are if both Christians and Jews claim they have the written Torah? And that's where Chazal say, well, the way God will really know is through the oral Torah. That's where the Brit is. And again, when we think about the oral Torah, we have to think about it in the sense that the written Torah was, again, given, written, that's fixed, but the oral Torah is what takes the written Torah into the here and now, right? The oral Torah is where we hear God's call, right? And the written Torah is where God's call was at Har Sinai, but the oral Torah is where we hear God's call right here, right now. And with the oral Torah, it represents not just like a particular set of texts, but a whole way of learning, right? For Rav Shagar emphasizes, the Gemara is the oral Torah. And what is the Gemara? It's dialogue, right? You learn it in dialogue, and the very text itself is a dialogue, right? It's about asking questions. It's about different perspectives, right? The very experience of learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, is one in which you encounter the other, you encounter different perspectives, and you grow ideally to love and feel bound to it, right? I'm not sure, I know people love Tanakh, right? And there's something very powerful about Tanakh, but there's also something incomparable about Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, that it grabs you in a way that, like, even Tanakh can't quite do that. And for Rav Shagar, it's through the oral Torah that we are able to hear God's call, and we are able to, find ourselves again in that Brit, in that covenant. He says the study of Torah is not a practice of attaining knowledge. Don't think Torah study is about learning details. It's about accumulating information. That could not be farther from the truth. If you think Torah study is that, it's not really a Brit at all. Because again, it's a self-centered enterprise. It's how do I take and receive? And that's it, right? Torah study is about relationship, because Brit is always about relationship. It's dialogical. It's going both ways. You're going to go into it not just assuming there's text to master, but there's like things you're not going to know. And there's things you're going to discover. And there's things that are going to challenge you. And there's things you're going to have to think about, right? That is what Torah study is going to be. There's something much, much more going on than Google and looking up in Wikipedia. The study of Torah is a way of life for the Jewish people. And more than that, it is the framework of the Brit between the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Jew. Our fundamental assumption is the Torah is the book of Brit. We read it in this week's Parsha in Mishpatim, Sefer HaBrit, right? The Torah is the book of the Brit, right? It could not be clearer. And this Brit means that the central function of the Torah for us is attachment, the intimacy that a Jew experiences in their relationship with God when studying Torah. If so, the study of Torah and engaging with it is the basic condition of Judaism. So I said here, there's a certain privileging of the intellect that to be part of the covenant, you have to study. And again, there's something about that that doesn't quite ring true, because not every Jew at every time can study the Torah, let alone the Gemara, in some great deep depth. But what I think is important to understand, particularly in like modernity, that it is hard to have a real relationship with Judaism without having a real relationship with Torah. Because as I said, you can't necessarily look out at the world and experience God. And therefore, the Torah is the primary place where we can hear, God's call. Rav Shagar continues, he says, the oral Torah that is in the language of the rabbis, mystery, that's the way they refer to the oral Torah as a mystery, but there's something about it that we can't fully ever know or understand. It's never fully complete, right? There's always mystery and eroticism always go hand in hand. And so part of what he's getting at here, and this is already an idea in Chazal, that the Torah is like an erotic object for us. The Zohar says this, it's always revealing and concealing. And I'm going to say something slightly inappropriate. It's as if the Torah is doing like a striptease. That's the way the Zohar sort of even almost explains it to us, right? There's something about the Torah that we see, but there's also that which we can't see, and we're constantly drawn into it. We're constantly like, there's more to know, more to understand, never fully capturing it all. And it's that eroticism that is at the heart of Brit, right? That's what love is, to be bound to the other, to be drawn to the other, to desire the other. He says in the marital context, the couple feels they are not able to focus their vision on each other. So what he's noting here is that there's a problem, particularly in modern relationships, that we don't really have this sense of Brit. And the reason we don't really have this sense of Brit is because we're constantly looking elsewhere. Even when we think we've chosen something, we're always seeing 1,000 other options. And therefore, we never feel completely settled into the choices that we actually make for ourselves, right? We don't make Brits today. We settle, right? Like that's the best way to describe it. We don't make a Brit, we settle. Right? A lot of people get married in the sense they settle. They finally get old enough, they say, okay, I got to find something, I be with somebody, I'm going to settle, right? That's not what Brit is. Brit is not settling. Brit is love and feeling, bound to the other. When you feel bound to them, there's a profound sense of exclusivity, right? This is the person who now structures my life, right? I am bound to them. This is my partner in the world, right? And it's very difficult to sometimes come to that sense, because when you enter it in contract, you are always looking, like, again, this is modern capitalism, consumerism. If you think of the world through contract, you're thinking, okay, I got a great deal over here, but what about the better deal that's over there, right? That's always the temptation with contracts. Can I find a better one? Covenants don't work that way. Once you're in, you're in. There's no better deal, because in a covenant, the other is irreplaceable, right? The one you love, there's nobody else like it. It doesn't matter if there's better deals. It's not about deals. You're bound to them. You love them. You only want this one, for better and for worse. He says, rather they glance all the time here and there due to foreign stimulation. That's the problem. We're always looking elsewhere for better deals, better options. The idea of covenants is so hard. The grass of the neighbors always appears greener in extreme circumstances. The alienation causes a lack of ability to connect at all, right? We're so unable to make a Brit. We can't even really, make any kind of real commitments. This kind of focus is an essential condition of study. To really study Torah, it's got to be, as the rabbis say, it's got to be your life and the days of your lives, right? It's got to be your everything, because that's what a Brit is. He says, the one who betrays a woman lacks a heart. Reish Lakish says, this is the one who studies Torah occasionally, right? You can't just study Torah once in a while. It's got to be central. Just like I can't just like see my wife once in a while, right? Like if she's my wife, it's my covenantal partner. I'm bound to them. I can't escape them. They're there all the time. And I have to acknowledge that and really make a space for that. The inability to persist, to dedicate oneself to the study of Torah often expresses a multidimensional problem that will appear in other areas. Meaning to commit to Torah, to be in a covenantal relationship with Torah means that I'm like, it's central to me. I keep coming back to it over and over again. That's the way Torah study works, right? You finish a Masechet and you end the Masechet of the Gemara saying Hadran. And what does Hadran mean? Return, right? That it's never that we like study some Torah and be like, okay, check that box off. I'm never coming back again. No, Torah is all about I'm coming back to you again and again. Like, as I love you, because I can't escape you, right? We read the Parsha. We read the same Parshas every year. We keep coming back to it again and again and again. Torah study is built on repetition, right? Over and over, we keep coming back to it. Because when you love something, as I keep saying, you can't escape it, right? That sense of repetition is what defines being bound to the other. Right, part of what makes married life difficult is the repetition, because we feel like repetition is boring. But we also have to understand that repetition is the way that we keep being drawn back in and can't quite escape. And sometimes we only really recognize the power of repetition when it's broken in some way, because then we feel the call that much stronger. Right, it's when the repetition breaks, we're like, oh, wait a second. Like now I feel that call, like I'm bound to them. How do I get back to them? How do I return? Right, and not so easy, but it's exactly feeling the force of that. That captures the way in which we are in a covenantal relationship. And for Rav Shagar, he talks a lot about this with Torah study in the sense that, again, this is like he's a Rosh Yeshiva, so obviously he's privileging the act of Torah study. But again, you just feel that it is the center point of your life. And I deeply relate to this because if I have a covenant with God, Torah, and the Jewish people, it is because I fell in love with Torah when I began learning, seriously, 20 years ago, whatever it was. And when I fell in love with Torah, I felt like it was going to fill my life with meaning and I was never going to quite escape it. And it's not an easy relationship. Like no covenantal relationship is easy, but it is profound in the way that it just, like I said, structures your life, becomes this thing that is axiomatic in the way that it provides, meaning and becomes the lens in which you look at the world because you wouldn't want to look at it any other way. And Rav Shagar describes here how is it that the Torah becomes this covenantal, relationship? He says he asked Rabbi, who was the head of Nativ Meir, it's a well-known yeshiva high school here. He asked him how long. This is when Rav Shagar was still a student. He says, until when should one study in the yeshiva? Meaning, how many years do you go study in yeshiva? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Some people like, how do you know when enough is enough? And here's the answer Rabbi gives. He says, until that stage when it is impossible without studying. Meaning you keep studying Torah till you reach a point where you realize you can't live without it. Until studying becomes this essential and necessary part of the learner's reality, like food and sleep. That's when you know you're in a covenantal relationship, when you can't live without it. Just like you can't live without food and sleep. It's just like a natural, necessary part of your existence. Can't have it any other way. As a young man, Rav Shagar says, his answer caused me disappointment, which came from a misunderstanding of his answer. I was expecting something much greater. Meaning Rav Shagar was expecting something more, spiritual, sophisticated, like when you start seeing Torah in a certain way or whatever, I don't know. But this is in some ways a much basic and much more essential answer. Was it possible to study like eating and sleeping? That's all? Like that's all it takes, right? But again, that's because we don't realize to make something like eating and sleeping is to elevate it to, the highest possible level. After that, I realized that this is indeed the goal, making the Torah part of the primary natural fabric of our lives, our culture, our spiritual existence, to our natural interest. In this deep assimilation of the Torah into natural existence lies the secret of infinite dedication and personal involvement. Like faith, Torah study of this kind also fades in the face of a demand for external reflection. Its strength lies in its unconscious flow and its self-evidentness. Right. So again, Torah study here, the way Rav Shagar is describing covenantal Torah study is to feel bound to it in ways that you can't escape it, that you keep coming back to it again and again and again. I'll just note that, it says, the Torah says, or the Tanakh says, V'higita bo yamam v'layla, that you're going to contemplate it, study it day and night. Right? There's a sense in which like you're constantly focused on it. And in the Gemara, they actually, connect this to the idea. The question raises is like, what's the minimal amount of Torah study? And the answer the Gemara gives is the saying of Kriyat Shema. Right? It's the most minimal answer, basically. Say Kriyat Shema in the morning, say it in the evening. But part of what that gets at is the way that our days and our existence is bound by Torah. And guess what? I mean, this is an important idea. I mean, I should mention this, right? Our days as Jews are not just bound by Torah because of the words that we say. Our days as Jews are bound by Torah, by the literal tefillin that we wear. When we put on tefillin, what we are doing is binding the Torah to our bodies. Remember I said that the way it means when you're in a covenant is that you don't know where you end and the covenantal partner begins? That's exactly what we're doing when we're putting on tefillin. We're saying that the distance between myself and Torah, not so clear, right? Like between Torah and our bodies, right? Like literally in an embodied sense, right? Because that's what covenant means. It's like, I hear my wife's voice in my head. I'm binding the Torah on my body, right? I am bound to it. I cannot escape it. And of course, as we finish wrapping the tefillin on Ashkenazim around their fingers, we say, we say that this is the verses from Hosea, but I am betrothed to you, God, forever, right? That's literally what we're doing with tefillin. It's a covenantal mitzvah par excellence, and we are showing how we are bound to God and to God's Torah in the act of wearing it, that we do every single day. So I want to keep developing this idea a little bit more so that we experience our covenantal relationship with God through the Torah, and being bound to the Torah, keep studying the Torah, returning to the Torah, can't live without the Torah, right? That is very important for Rav Shagar. But there's another dimension that I want to focus on as well, and that is that when we are in a covenant, we don't just feel bound to the other, we feel bound to the desires of the other. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that when you are in a covenant, the other is going to want things, and you are inevitably going to feel that you want to live up to and follow through those desires, right? You can't escape it, right? When you're bound to another in a covenant, you feel those desires as commands, right? You feel them as imperatives, even if they're not necessarily given over exactly as a command, but you feel it that way, right? Because to be bound to the other is to keep asking yourself, what does the other want? And am I getting it right? And those are not so easy questions for us to answer. We know this is Jews, right? Torah study is the fundamental act of trying to figure out what God wants. And halacha is like the constant discourse about asking ourselves, did we get it right or not, right? The answers to those questions are ultimately, we're not quite sure, which makes them really not so easy. And what Rav Shagar points out is to be bound in covenant, to be bound in the sense that we want to follow through, live up, answer the desires of the other, comes with a certain amount of neuroticism. It's not so simple, right? To be in a relationship with the other is to experience commands, right? Because that's what it means to be bound to another person and experience their desires, what we call mitzvot. But it's not so easy, right? And for Rav Shagar, this is actually a really essential point, right? If you want to know whether you're in a covenant with something, it's not just that you keep returning to it. It's not just that you're bound by it. It's that you're constantly like fretting whether or not you're able to live up to it and live up to it in the way that you feel that the other would want you to, right? That's what really like shows us what a covenant is. And that anxiety is not so simple. That's why, marriages are full of all sorts of anxieties that both partners kind of push down or cover up, or just basically say, we don't have to have anxieties. We can say, this is exactly what our relationship is going to look like, this and nothing more. But it's always more complicated than that. So Rav Shagar says, this is him focusing on sort of the neuroticism that's at the heart of any covenantal relationship. He says, it follows that the difference between the various approaches will relate to the difficult point. He calls this the nikudat kasha. Every covenant has a nikudat kasha, this hard, difficult point. The compulsiveness and neurosis that, as noted, create the halachic taboo and are internalized by halacha itself. To be in a covenant with the other is in some way to always feel bound to the other, to be commanded by the other. The nikudat kasha is this sensibility that we can't ever quite escape it. It's why it's hard to be married. It's why it's hard to be in relationship with other Jews. Because when you're bound to other Jews, and as a Jew, you're always bound to other Jews, what they want matters. What they need matters. And that's hard, especially when what they want, need isn't what we think is good for them or good for us. But to be in a relationship with them means to some level feel responsible to that, to their wants, their needs, their desires, their imperatives, their commands. And that's not easy at all. We often try to cover it up by saying, okay, we're going to define exactly what those are and nothing more. But it's never quite that simple. Only by positing this difficult point can halacha impart a belief in the Torah is from heaven. If you want to know the Torah is from heaven, Rav Shagar is saying, It's not a question of whether it was given at Sinai. I mean, maybe it is, but that's not really the defining question. The defining question of whether the Torah is from Sinai or the Torah is from heaven is whether you have a covenantal relationship to it. And the question of whether you not have a covenantal relationship to it is, do you feel that it impels you, right? The difference between my relationship with my wife and every other human being's relationship with my wife is that when my wife says something, or she says she wants something, or says she needs something, I feel it completely differently than any other human being on the planet. Every other human being will be like, okay, she wants or needs that, whatever. But when I hear my wife says she wants or needs something, I feel it very differently. I feel it because I'm bound to her, so I have to end up feeling it differently. And it has that sense of, again, neurosis, compulsion. How do I give her what she wants? How do I be what she wants? What exactly does she want? Right? That is this hard point that defines a covenantal relationship. And again, from Shagar, to be in covenant means on some level as a Jew, feeling bound to halacha. Now we could argue like how big or how small halacha has to be, but it still means you feel bound to God's wants, God's desires, God's imperatives. If you can enter into a relationship with God and just love studying Torah and that's it, then you're missing something, because Torah is full of God's desires, God's wants, God's imperatives. And if you really take Torah study seriously, you can't help but feel those desires, those wants calling to you. And on some level, feel like I have to live up to them, right? If I stop listening to my wife, right? If I just say I'm going through the motions, but she keeps telling me she wants all these things, she needs all these things, and I'm just going to stop listening to her, I'm not really in a relationship with her at all. Maybe I like living with her because she's a great cook. Maybe I like studying Torah because I find it intellectually satisfying. But the way I know I'm in a covenant is the way, again, I feel bound and called by the other. And this is an idea that you see elsewhere. I mean, I'll show this here in the Rambam. In Hilchot Shuvah, he talks about what it means to love God. And what's fascinating is, even though the Rambam is famous for his intellectualized thinking about love, Rambam's the great rationalist, he describes a picture here about loving God that's actually a little bit unsettling. Here's what he says. He says, what is the proper degree of love? That a person should love God with a great and exceeding love until his soul is bound up in the love of God. Right? You should love God, and you should love God to the sense that you feel bound to God, right? Similar to what we've already seen. But here's where it goes to another level. He says, thus, if you really love God, he will always be obsessed with this love, as if he is lovesick. A lovesick person's thoughts are never diverted from the love of that woman. He's always obsessed with her when he sits down, when he gets up, when he eats, and when he drinks. Meaning, if you really love God, you're always going to be thinking about God. But what's fascinating is that language of almost like obsession that the Rambam is using here. We wouldn't think it's such a healthy or good thing to obsess about the one you love, to think about them all the time. Right? We might think there's something a little uncomfortable about that, but that's what love is. And he cites here, from Shir HaShirim, cholat ahava, right? Love, to truly be in love is to be lovesick, right? Which means that if we call being lovesick, means there's something about love that's not always so pleasant, right? Not always so easy. Right? Like it's something that's, again, beyond your control. Part of being lovesick is you want to do everything you can to satisfy the other. It's not an easy thing to do, an easy place to be. He says with an even greater love, the love for God should be implanted in the hearts of those who love him and are obsessed with him at all times, as we are commanded, with all your heart, with all your soul. This concept implied by Solomon when he stated as a metaphor, I am lovesick. Indeed, the totality of Song of Songs is a parable describing this love. Right, what Shir HaShirim gets at is the love that animates covenant. The way the Raya and the Dod, the lover and the beloved, are bound to each other and constantly obsessing about each other and wanting to be together. But again, it's not an easy place to be bound to others that way. To feel connected to them and to feel that we have a responsibility to them. That when they call, there's a part of us that, if we're going to be in a relationship with them, has to respond. Not an easy thing. Not an easy thing at all. And I want to conclude by taking us back to the text that we looked at in the first session. Because if you remember, again, just to summarize here, to be a Jew means to be in covenant with God, Torah, and the Jewish people. The primary way in which we experience our covenant with God is through the Torah, through the engagement with Torah, right? And the way in which we love God, or fall in love with God, is to a large extent through falling in love with Torah, right? And feeling bound to Torah, bound to God, bound to God's love, bound to God's desires, to having that be this pillar, this axiomatic point which orients our existence that we keep coming back to because that's where we find meaning. That's one dimension. On the other hand, there's this dimension of halacha, mitzvot, of feeling bound not just to return to the other because we find it as a source of meaning, but being bound to the desires and wants of the other. And often being anxious about, are we getting it right? Are we doing it properly? Right? That's what it means to be somebody who's like frum. And I mean that in the best possible way. You feel bound to the other's wants and desires. There's like things God wants you to do, and I may not always like it and agree with it. But guess what? Not every time my wife tells me she wants things cleaned up a certain way, or for me to do something in the house, does it make sense to me, or do I want to do it? But if I want to be in a relationship with her, I know it's important that when she says those things, I feel called, I feel responsible to it, as difficult as that might be. Because that's what love is. That's what it means to be bound to the other in love. And if you remember back in the first session, Rav Shagar was trying to rethink faith after the Yom Kippur War. What does it mean to still have faith in God after the traumas that he experienced? And one of this metaphor that he develops is the idea of shade, the shade of faith of the sukkah. To dwell in the sukkah is to dwell in God's shade. But what Shagar wants to keep emphasizing is that metaphor is not this comfortable, confident one, because the sukkah doesn't really prevent any harm from happening to you. You're out in the sukkah in the rain, you're going to get wet. You're out in the sukkah and if the wind's blowing, sukkah may collapse on you. And Rav Shagar's point is it doesn't matter, because when it comes to the sukkah, that's where a Jew wants to be. We want to be in the sukkah, in the shade, even if it's never fully going to protect us. We want to be in relationship with God, God's Torah, the Jewish people, even if we know that it's not going to make sense, that we're not going to always get out of it what we want, but because we feel bound to it. And to express that, Rav Shagar turns to a midrash from Shir HaShirim, because you recognize the only thing that can really explain what it means to be bound to the other in that kind of fashion, in a way that makes us vulnerable, in a way that provides profound meaning, but doesn't really provide us any security, and that is love. And what he used here was the midrash in Shir HaShirim of the Jews wanting to dwell in God's shade, even when God doesn't really provide much shade, right? He uses the metaphor of the apple tree, right? The non-Jews in the world don't want to dwell in God's shade, right? And the implication here, and this is important, is because non-Jews know that being God's chosen people doesn't always get you that many good things. It doesn't really make sense. When it's really hot and sunny outside, you go where the shade is. And the Jews, that's not what they do. We go where God is, as difficult as that might be, even when it doesn't make sense. It certainly doesn't make sense to the non-Jews. That's what the Midrash is getting at here. But nonetheless, as it says in Shir HaShirim, I delight to sit in his shade. The beloved wants to dwell in the shade of the lover. That's the only place we want to be, even if it's painful, even if it's difficult, because we feel bound to them. And when we hear them call, we feel that we have no choice but to say, Hineni, here I am. That's where I'm going to be. Doesn't make sense. It's not always easy. That's what love is. But when we experience it and when we feel bound to the other, and in this sense, it's the concrete other of God and Torah, the concrete other of other Jews, when we feel bound to that, and again, I'm going to say here, I'm teaching for Drisha. You don't come into Drisha if in some level you don't feel bound to Torah, if you don't feel bound to other Jews. Like I have some sense of the people who come here, like you're doing this. You're people who love Torah. You're people who probably are active in your Jewish communities and connected to other Jews. You feel that sense of covenant. And the very fact that you feel that sense of covenant means that it's real. Because if it wasn't, you'd run away from it. But you've probably maybe tried that in your life. It doesn't really work. You keep coming back because that's what a covenant means. And again, faith is about remaining loyal to that covenant, even when it doesn't make sense. And when you hear the other call, whether it's God's voice in the Torah or other Jews, right? Even when you don't want to, right? To be in that covenant means you hear that call, you hear your name being called, and you don't have any choice but to say, here I am. Don't always understand what that means. Doesn't always mean you agree with what the other wants. A lot of times we don't. But to be in a covenant means to be loyal. So like I said, that when your name is called, you're still able to answer and you return. We'll end with that. And I have a couple of minutes, but I think we're right at the end of time in case anybody has any questions.
So yeah, feel free to unmute and verbally make comments and ask questions. I know that Judith also wrote something in the chat. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So let me address this. So yes, This is heavily gendered, everything that I'm saying here, heavily gendered. And I'm using that language because that is the traditional language. One thing I will note, a couple of things, is that even though it's still masculine, the fascinating thing about the first breed I mentioned, that's really the primary love breed that we see, is between David and Yehonatan. So the first thing I want to note is that this is not, and let's assume that relationship is not a sexual one. There's no reason to assume otherwise. That the love that we're describing here It doesn't mean if you're not married that you've never experienced that kind of love. And it doesn't mean that it is gender specific in that kind of way. I want to just note that love, the way love works is that it doesn't really care about gender, right? Like that's what makes love such a powerful force and such a disruptive force. And yes, you're absolutely right that women did not traditionally study Torah. And as we know, the other primary symbol of Brit is Brit Milah, right? Women did not have a Brit Milah. There's been books written on, are women really part of the covenant if they don't have a Brit Milah, right? That is the challenge. But I will say this, that the women were present at Har Sinai. They were present at the end of the Torah when God affirms the Brit, when Moshe affirms the Brit with men and women. But yeah, we have a fair question to ask here, is that in a certain sense, the structural form of Judaism has been in which men really are the active participants, partners of the Brit with God. I mean, but as I said, at the same time, when we look at the Torah, that's never quite the full answer. And I think for me, at least me personally, everything I'm saying here, well, again, using gendered language, for me at least, it applies equally, to women without question, because at a certain level, to be in a Brit in the time that we live in is a very individual thing, right? Like nobody can force a Brit on you. At the end of the day, you have to be able to answer for yourselves, whether or not like you hear that call, you feel that call. And that's something every Jew has to do. And one of the beautiful things about modernity is the way it makes us recognize that this isn't just like for men or for rabbis or women are separate. Like we're all in the same boat here. Nobody's got the answers. And the question is whether or not we can really, like I said, hear that call and be able to answer it. I know, Judy, it looks like Judy, you had another question. You're muted, at least for me.
Oh, Judith, you're actually unmuted, but we can't hear you still. Do you want to maybe type it in the chat? I think you might have an issue with your audio. Yeah, no, we can't hear you, even though you're unmuted, but maybe you can write something in the chat or otherwise next time.
While she's writing it in the chat, is that also the concept of chakal tapuchim, the apple orchard in the literature of Zohar?
So so the apple tree, the orchard is the language from Shir HaShirim that has resonances on many levels. In the Zohar, it has already early in rabbinic literature in this kind of erotic but like mystical sense. Yeah, it's very, very powerful, powerful there.
Okay.
We say like, tachat tapuach. I'm not going to get the verse right. Tachat tapuach oratich, right? Under the apple tree, you aroused. And that is already in rabbinic literature referring to the way in which the women seduced their husbands in Egypt. So to ensure that they would continue to be Jews, even at a time when Pharaoh's decree was such that all Jewish babies would be, thrown into the Nile. And there again, you see it, right? It's the love that expressed through covenant, right? Jews being bound to God, but in that moment, the Jewish husbands and wives being bound to each other, that actually enables the covenant to continue to be real. Any other comments or questions?
I think, Chaim, are you trying to talk still? You're on mute. Were you trying to say something?
I was apologizing to Judy for interrupting her.
I think we can't hear Judy. Her sound doesn't work. But Judy, if you'd like to, maybe next time. Yehudit, do you have a question? Yehudit, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I can't be on camera. So I think there are two things. I know you've been very focused on talking about between man and wife, but and also the feeling that one has with regard to loved ones and family. But I think when you talk about Brit, I think maybe you also mean, because we're talking about Am Yisrael, that somehow when someone is hurt in the land of Israel or someplace else, or we feel for other Jews, and this is a very in some respect, it's a little bit different than other people. We because we're a small people, but I think also because there's something special about the connections between all of Am Yisrael, and not so much about between male and female, but there's a brit between us as a people and Hakadosh Baruch Hu, but also the fact that among ourselves, that all of us, like the kind of like a brit of Havat Yisrael between us that is different than other and to a certain extent than other nations, and then that also reflects the Brit, kind of like a mystery of the Brit between us and Hakadosh Baruch Hu, in that there are things that are unsaid but are felt, and it's felt on a national level, and it's felt as between Ben Adam and Chavero. And so I think we, in trying to understand Rav Shagar, we need to expand it and in a wider sense in order to try to understand him.
Yes, I hope that, I think I said it earlier on, is that when we think of Brit, it always is bilateral. It's between us and God, as expressed in our relationship to the Torah, but it is equally manifested in our relationship to other Jews. That those dual directions are always going on. And this is very clear in rabbinic literature early on. I mean, this is not a great, any chiddush, right? When we say Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh, that every Jew is responsible for another, that's a halachic consequence of the Brit. That I can fulfill a mitzvah on your behalf is because we're all in this together, and we're all bound, to each other. Now, the only thing I'll just add is that you can understand Brit as making everything like one, right? Like all the Jewish people are one. Right, like a Jew suffers in Timbuktu, and I feel their pain. Now, there's a certain romantic sense to that, but I think what we also have to keep in mind with Brit is that we never fully know nor understand the other in the context of a covenantal relationship. Right, there's always a gap between us and the other. Right, it's not two becomes one. Right, and I think that's very important because it can be very easy to assume that we have some sort of metaphysical connection to other Jews and we all share one soul, and therefore, like I said, when the pain of one is my pain, that's not exactly true. At least I would argue. The covenant means that when the other calls, like I feel a responsibility to answer. Not that I fully understand them, because I'll never understand them fully. Right? And that's part of the problem with Jews. We think we know what's best for other Jews because we're all one. And if you have the metaphysical truth of that, you can say, okay, this is right. This is what it should be for you. And that's a big problem in the country I live in right now. But covenant means, to a certain extent, the unknowability of the other. That includes God and our fellow Jews, which means we don't know what's right for them. They don't know what's right for us. But when either of those sides call, right, we feel that pull to answer. And that is what it means to be in a Brit.
I think, as David says, this is the concept of Brit is also Avdut and Inui. It's not just unity; it's also the sense of the torn parts too.
Yeah, of course. Look, I mean, like I said before, with the example with my wife, the hardest thing about being in a covenantal relationship is that the comments that the other makes aren't just like comments. When another Jew lays out those beliefs and expectations out there, we feel it's in a very different way than when some, person we don't have that kind of connection with, like, makes sort of claims or judgments, right? That's what's hard about a Brit, is that when we're bound to them, they want things, they do things, and we feel it intensely, and it's hard. But it's also what, again, gives us meaning and gives our world a sense of meaning, to be bound in others in that kind of way. It's tough. Like, again, I want to be clear here. Love and covenant and the Torah and the Jewish people, these are not easy things. And too much of like religious thinking and language makes it romantic, puts a nice bow on it, makes it simple and obvious and clear. Right? These are like complicated, messy, and hard. That's what the Torah is. I mean, you look at Torah closely, right? It is every step of the way. It is, Jewish people and God, right? It's complicated, messy, and hard. But again, anything that's worthwhile in life, that's really, really worthwhile, is complicated, messy, and hard. And it means learning how to own up to that.
Thank you.
All right, we'll end here. And we will pick up next week, I think, with the question of suffering, which is really the question of like what happens when the Brit gets pushed to like almost like a breaking point, right? Which is exactly the challenge. How do we still remain loyal to a Brit when it feels like it's already past the, the breaking point? And that's where we'll be next time.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say a quick, Judith, I'm so sorry that we weren't able to hear you today. Would have loved to hear your comment, and I'm sorry that it didn't work. Thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you everyone who joined us here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next week.